John asks, how powerful are select committees in holding government and other bodies to account? Highly important topic at the moment, given Lord Cameron cannot be held to account in the House of Commons. It leaves the Foreign Affairs Select Committee as the only Commons body to do so. Also considered the Business and Trade Committee back in 2015 regarding the post office scandal, which failed to move the dial until the recent docudrama. So, Freddie, do you want to have a go at either defending or lamenting select committees?
Yeah, I mean, this has come to the fore because David Cameron was made Foreign Secretary at the reshuffle in the autumn, and essentially he was put in the Lords so that he could join the government because he wasn't an MP, and that led to some questions about how you hold such a senior member of cabinet to account if he's in the Lords, and the Lords obviously aren't elected, so people thought that was quite undemocratic. And the sort of the thing that's mollified some MPs is that you have the Foreign Select Committee, who is made up of MPs, and they will hold him to account as they did a couple of weeks ago. So that's the way in which they're seeing accountability play out.
Around the point of international humanitarian law, if Israel have the power to turn the water back on that they turned off, surely that is a flagrant breach of international humanitarian law.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. My view is they ought to switch it on because the north of Gaza, the conflict is now effectively over there, and so getting more water and power into northern Gaza would be a very good thing to do.
I mean, there's still debates going on about how you hold Cameron to account. I think the Speaker has asked the Procedures Committee to look into this, and I understand that the Procedures Committee are going to recommend next week that David Cameron be called to the bar of the House. Now, the bar of the House is this line in the House of Commons which non-members, non-MPs can't pass. And so what they do when they're trying to, hold a non-member to account, they'll call someone to the bar. And the last time this happened was in 1957. I think it was a Sunday Express journalist called Sir John Junor who had criticised MPs, and they called him to the House to apologise, essentially. So it's used extremely rarely. And
imagine how many journalists they'd have to call to the bar of the House now.
Yeah, there would be a roll call, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that would be quite extraordinary if that actually happened. So the Procedure Committee, I understand, are going to recommend that. Then I think it'll be up to the Lords and the Speaker of the House of Commons if that happens. But it'd be quite extraordinary to have David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, stood behind this bar in the House of Commons on TV, being held to account by MPs. So this has caused ramifications within Parliament about how you do this. I mean, there is some historical precedent. We've talked about it before. Lord Mandelson, Lord Carrington. But yeah, David Cameron in such a senior position at such a pivotal time for foreign policy, people are quite irked about it, and MPs are looking into it.
Yeah, and I think I remember reading when Cameron had just been appointed that he was nervous that could come to pass and that it could be a way for MPs in the Commons to sort of hammer him with questions, which, presumably when he took up the role, he knew he'd be slightly insulated from that, albeit, the Select Committee is there.
Yeah, and what we've essentially seen so far is Andrew Mitchell, who looks after international development, and some people sort of see as the Deputy Foreign Minister. He's been taking questions in the Commons on foreign policy as Cameron's deputy, and Cameron's been taking questions in the Lords. Going back to the Select Committees, I did sit in David Cameron's appearance at the Foreign Select Committee, and I do think it was a good example of Select Committees being able to hold politicians to account in a way that the House of Commons can't. I mean, take ministers' questions, right? This is one of the key ways in which ministers in the government are held to account by MPs. It is just full of grandiloquent procedure, ritual, gratitude, expressions of gratitude for members and their constituencies. You don't get that in select committees. What you get is a chair and a group of MPs who are supposed to be experts in the policy area, grilling the politician for 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, and they're the ones that can interject, as Alicia Kearns, the chair of the Foreign Select Committee, did quite well, I think.
Forgive me, Sir Philip, under international obligations, do occupying powers have an obligation to provide access to water, yes or no?
You're asking me a technical legal question.
Sir Philip, I'm really, forgive me, you and I have played this dance enough times. We all know that under international law, there is an obligation for occupying powers to provide water.
Yeah, I would defend select committees as well. I disagree with John, who sent in the question about the Business and Trade Committee on the post office scandal. Because if you look at those transcripts from the 2015 hearing, I mean, it really is quite a robust grilling of Paula Venables in particular, who was the head of the post office at the time. And they did stop prosecuting their own staff in 2015. I mean, obviously that's a low bar, and a lot of injustice has obviously happened since. But it was, it was quite significant, and it actually did feature as a seminal moment in that ITV drama that's brought all of this scandal to the fore again. So I would defend it. And actually, I think they have a way, select committees in general, of capturing the public mood more than Parliament does with all of its arcane procedure and people shouting and harumphing and making all of those strange noises, because they do actually look, a bit more normal to the public. It's, a person of note being asked questions by, supposedly experts around a horseshoe table, and it's not scripted in the same way. There's not as many sort of party lines being trotted out in the same way. And, they really do, some of these select committees that we've had over the years do stick in my mind, like Rupert Murdoch admitting it was the most humble day of my life when he was called before the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee in 2011 on phone hacking. And you had George Entwistle, who admitted that, he hadn't asked follow-up questions about the Jimmy Savile sex abuse story. And he said he admitted there was a culture within the BBC that allowed him to get away with abuse for so many decades. I mean, that was a really memorable hearing. Mike Ashley, the founder of Sports Directors, had to go before select committees a few times. He was actually had to be summoned because he kept refusing to go. And he had major clashes with MPs over
this is a key point, isn't it?
Were treated.
It's not just MPs and ministers that are held to account. It's select committees can call in, business leaders, charities, NGOs, both for evidence, and to scrutinise them in a way that the House can't.
Yeah.
To see, elected representatives of the people grill business owners. I mean, Darren Jones sort of made his name as a backbencher doing this on the business select committee.
Well, exactly, as did Margaret Hodge on the Public Accounts Committee. She used to get Google, Amazon, Starbucks execs in and hammer them about the tax affairs of their sort of multinational companies, which is quite an amazing sort of privileged position to have, because not only can MPs not usually do this, but most bodies can't usually hold these huge companies to account. And she actually told me when I interviewed her fairly recently that it was in this time that she felt like she had the most influence, more so than when she was a minister. She said, her career was most successful in her 60s when she was chairing that committee. So I would defend their role.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, I mean, the question sort of alludes to the fact that select committees don't get that much coverage. And that may be the case. I mean, they're happening all of the time. There are constant hearings going on, and they don't always grab the headlines in the way that you mentioned. But nonetheless, they're still producing reports that are helpful for the media. They're used by MPs. They sort of have the time to collate the evidence over issues that other people might not. And then when you have these quite, dramatic, they are performative in many ways, interrogations, it puts it to the top of the headlines, and they have the report to back it up. So they're not perfect, I don't think. It's also worth, it's worth noting that the government, for instance, still has a majority on these select committees. So it's not as if they're completely separate from the Conservative Party or the government at the time. But in terms, relative to the House of Commons, I do think that they are an effective way of holding people to account.
Yeah, and there's a good point about the makeup of them, because while, of course, they do reflect the sort of balance of power in Parliament, you also get very independent-minded MPs coming out of select committees who work cross-party. And that's something, the public generally, looks, quite fondly on MPs who work across party on the subjects that matter to them. And you give the example of Alicia Kearns, who obviously wasn't giving David Cameron an easy ride, even though she is also a Conservative.
Yeah, and I think that's partly explained by the fact that many MPs see being a chair of a select committee as a good way of, boosting their profile, as getting on, on the sort of shortlist for becoming a minister.
Yeah.
I think the way in which the media and their own peers see select committees as changed in recent years, in part just because we are seeing these big spectacles and we are seeing companies held to account. So they've got a much greater level of legitimacy and credibility and authority, I think, than compared to what they used to be like.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.